Well, I had already been primed by Vishnujan Maharaj, and a few other joys had preached to me really beautifully, and so I kind of knew already I was going to join, but I had only been there 2 days. And then Srila Prabhupada arrived, and it was just splendor on all levels. You know, when I saw him, I just cried, and he was the most beautiful person I had ever seen, and I knew immediately that he was my spiritual master. Well, we went to Hawaii to train up some of the book distributors. At that time we had figured out how to sell books in many, many languages in international people, and so it was very exciting because we were able to distribute books to countries that nobody could go to, and Srila Prabhupada heard about this and he was excited about it. And while I was in Hawaii, I used to go to the airport every day wearing a sari and tilak, and one day I was coming home from the airport and I was walking across the lawn, and Prabhupada was up on the balcony of his room, and he saw me. And so then he called over Upendra, who was acting as his servant at that time, and he said, "So she is coming from preaching?" And he said, "Yes, Prabhupada, I think she's coming." Prabhupada said, I would like to speak with her. Would she like to come up? So Upendra, who was my friend, he ran down the stairs and he goes, "Mula, Prabhupada's asking if you'd like to talk to him in his room right now." Well, my hair was standing in all directions. I had had a long day at the airport. And I was very nervous, but I went up the stairs and I didn't know what to expect. And Prabhupada was sitting there alone in his room at that desk that's still there now. And first I paid my obeisances and I sat kind of near the back, and Prabhupada kept motioning for me to come closer and closer. And so finally I was scooted up quite close to where he was, just next to his desk on the floor. And Prabhupada said, "So, tell me about the preaching. Tell me about Sankirtan. How is it going?" And so I started to talk a little bit. First I was very nervous. I was choking, and I just said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, people are taking your books. They like your books." He goes, "Yes? They are liking?" I said, "Yes, Srila Prabhupada. And not only people in America, but people from all over the world." He goes, "Well, tell me, what kind of people? What kind of people did you distribute to today?" So I said, well, I was straining my brain. Teachers and students and lawyers and mothers and old people, just every kind of person. And he said, more people? So I was like trying to think of more people, and he was leaning over. He was very excited to hear. And he said, and what are they saying? I said, well, they say that they're interested in this kind of knowledge. He goes, well, what do you say? And I said, well, I say that, it's transcendental knowledge. You can't find it in any other book. It's very, it will make you happy. It's about God and about love of God, like that. And he said, yes, this is very nice. He says, I know what I want you to say. And so he called for his servant, and his servant came and he asked him to bring Bhagavatam 1:1. And then he pulled open to it almost immediately, just knew exactly where it was, and he opened it up, and he opened up to that verse that says, this Bhagavat Purana is as brilliant as the sun, and it disappeared just after the departure of Lord Sri Krishna, accompanied by religion, knowledge, etc. Persons who have lost their vision due to the dense darkness in this age of Kali shall get light from this Purana. And he said, see how beautifully Srimad Bhagavatam sells itself. He says, anyone who heard this from Srimad Bhagavatam itself, they would think, I must read that book, I must. He said, so that's what you can need to tell the people. You just tell them straight from Srimad Bhagavatam. He said, I am very excited myself when I read this Srimad Bhagavatam, so certainly they will be as well. So then he said, and what countries are you distributing to? So I started listing all the countries I could possibly think of that we had ever distributed a book to. And he was saying, more. And I told the story already about going across the Iron Curtain. I remember telling that. And then he was just saying, he Because I am sitting here in my room and I am absorbed in writing these literatures. And he goes, and I am thinking all the time while I'm writing these literatures how they are being received by the public. He said, this book distribution, it's not just book distribution, but it's also popularization of this transcendental knowledge. He goes, so I want it to be popularized everywhere, and I want it to be distributed very nicely so people will appreciate. So while we were talking, Prabhupada was like, it was quite a question and answer kind of thing, and I was very young in those days and very enthusiastic, and my technique for distributing books was that if people would talk, sometimes I would interrupt them. So Srila Prabhupada was kind of talking, and then at one point he was asking me some question, and he kind of leaned back. He was dressed, he had no shirt on, he just had his cloth on, and it was a sunny, beautiful day, and he was so beautiful, and he was sitting like this, very sweetly and very ecstatically, just leaning back, and then he'd lean forward, his eyes would get really big, and he would ask these questions. So at one point, he leaned back, I think he was thinking, and he started a question, and I just interrupted him and finished the question for him. And just at that moment, there was one sannyasi who was one of his servants who just happened to be walking by, and he heard me do it. And he went, like, and I thought, oh no, I was so embarrassed. And I closed my mouth, and I just kind of looked at Prabhupada, but Prabhupada was just kind of like finished the sentence again and clarified it. And so then we were talking more back and forth, and he was telling me all these sweet stories about salesmanship and about women and about preaching, and just very beautiful, sweet things, and a few things about himself when he was preaching. And then he started to say some comment, and it was a very deep comment. And he started, and he just hesitated for a second, and I just interrupted again. And this time I was really wrong, too. I interrupted, and I said something that wasn't what he wanted. So he kind of went, like, kind of shocked, because it wasn't what he was going to say. And then again, that sannyasi was somehow in the room, and he just went like, like, kind of like, and he was furious with me. And so I didn't know what to do. I felt so mortified, and I was so fallen, and I put my head down, and I kind of was like in the midst of like a mortified kind of head down and trying to make an obeisance and trying to figure out how I could get out of the room backwards because I thought my spiritual life was finished. And so I was kind of figuring out, but I couldn't figure out any decent way to get out of the room because it was quite a long ways, and I didn't know if I could see behind me. And it was very quiet, and there was no sound, not anything. And then I just felt something, and so I was down on the ground like this, and Prabhupada was sitting right on his desk, and I kind of peeked up, and I opened up one eye, and Srila Prabhupada had bent over like this on his elbows, and he had bent way over on his desk, and he was leaning forward practically right next to me, and he was just smiling very beautifully with so much love, and just looking at me with so much love. And I kind of didn't say anything, and then Prabhupada said to the servant who was also standing there, he said, "Just see, she is so enthusiastic." So that was a great, enormous delivery of mercy, which I shall never ever forget. So as we were talking like that, Srila Prabhupada looked like a young boy. He was so beautiful and brilliant and very enjoying himself tremendously. And I also was enjoying myself. And I was giggling too. I don't remember what was so funny, but it was very joyful. And then there was a bang on the door, a couple bangs on the door, and the door opened, and in came some of the temple managers and GBCs from that area, and a few other people, and they all came in. It was kind of heavy duty, walked in and said, "Prabhupada, we have some issues we need to discuss with you." And immediately, Prabhupada's face just fell, and he took away his hands like that, and he kind of got like this in his chair, and then he looked over at me, and he kind of shrugged like this, like kind of sadly, like that was over, our conversation was over. And then he he began to talk to them, and then at one point, they were talking about other things, and then at one point he asked one of them, "So how is your college preaching going?" And that devotee said, "Oh, Prabhupada, we're very much liking the preaching." He goes, "I am hearing about it." And he said, "I am hearing very many good things about the preaching." He pointed over to me. And then he said, tell me. And so the devotee started to tell, but he said, and Prabhupada goes, "And how are the books going?" And he said, "Well, Prabhupada, actually we're not distributing the books at the colleges because, we're not allowed to take any money, and we actually give some lectures, and then we give out cookbooks." And Prabhupada said, "I have not written any cookbook." "Did I?" He said, "Have I written any cookbook?" And they said, "Well, it's been put together. It has some little bit of philosophy and stuff like that." And Prabhupada says, "Why do you think I am staying here day and night writing and writing? Because I want these books to go out." He said, "So you may give one lecture, but the chances are that it will go in one ear and go out the other ear. But," he said, "if you just even give them one book of mine," he said, "it will stick." And then at that point he just said, "Okay, everyone out." He said, "I'm tired, I need to go. We can discuss these things later." And then as he was leaving, then I also was like paying obeisances, and I was also leaving. And then Prabhupada turned to me, he said, "Thank you very much." The first time I was in Vrindavan, and Srila Prabhupada was there, and he would take his morning walk every morning. And there was a crew of us. I was just a newcomer. I didn't know anything very much at that time about cleaning his rooms. And it was very fastidious. And the girl that was in charge, she knew every little thing, every tiny thing to do. And there was a short time, he took a short walk. So she told me, "Oh, you can do the upstairs where his little desk is," and sometimes he took prasadam up there. She goes, "Because that's just the tiniest, smallest little area, so you can do that part." And I was nervous, but she said, "All you have to do is the desk. You don't even have to do the floor. Someone else will come do that. You just do the desk, and remember to put everything back the exact way you saw it, and clean it perfectly." So I got up there, and I started getting a little bit nervous because it was like a math problem or something, and I was so nervous I couldn't quite remember where everything went. I took it up, and then by the time it was time to put it down, I couldn't quite remember where it was supposed to go, but I was doing my best, and I was dusting everything, and I was starting to sweat, getting more and more nervous, and there was quite a lot of things on that desk, and I was doing as good as I could, as well as I could. And then at one moment, she said, "Oh, time, Prabhupada's coming, everyone down." So I had a terrible feeling like I hadn't really had even a good look at what I had done or not done. And I felt incomplete. But anyway, I had no choice. I ran down the stairs. And then I was standing by the side of his room as he went into his room. And I noticed with a terrible sense of shock that he didn't go to any of his downstairs rooms. He went straight upstairs. And then I looked up there and I could see him going and sitting down at his desk. And within 1 minute, there was this loud, "Haribol! Who has cleaned this room?" And so Devi Shakti ran up there, and then she came back down and she said, "Mula, you really messed up." And I was like, I know, what did I do? And she said, "Well, Prabhupada noticed immediately that you had put his glass of water in not quite in the exact place, and the little tiny silver cup top that goes on top of his water, you forgot to dust that." So I was amazed at Srila Prabhupada that of all the things that were done in that room, that he had that kind of ability to immediately find that. And ever since then, I've always remembered that standard of cleanliness. And whenever I think I'm cleaning for Srila Prabhupada or for the deities, I remember that, and I know that he's looking and he can see every little thing that might be missed. We didn't so often get invited into Srila Prabhupada's garden for the afternoon darshans, but somehow one time we made some record amount of book distribution, and as a reward we got to go to Prabhupada's garden. So I was sitting there, was just a few devotees there. It was a beautiful afternoon, and Prabhupada was very regal, sitting on his dais there. And again, it was an Indian gentleman who walked in at one point, and he was this tall man, and he had a dhoti on, like an orange dhoti, and some kind of a Ivy League shirt with a jacket on. like he was a professor or something like that. And when he began to speak, he spoke like that, like he'd been in the West for a while, and he was trying to integrate whatever little, bit of Krishna consciousness he had brought back from India. But he was respectful to Srila Prabhupada, and Srila Prabhupada was very affectionate to him. And he sat him down right beside him, and he began, in a very masterful way, to discuss with him just very light and sweet things like the weather and, the garden, and just very nice things. And the man was feeling excited. He was kind of talking and saying affectionate things to Srila Prabhupada. And then at one point, Srila Prabhupada said something confronting on one of the things that he had said. He had just said some kind of impersonal thing, and Prabhupada caught him on it. And I can't remember what it was exactly, something about Krishna being a person. And the man, he kind of was balking at that. And then Prabhupada started to get a little heavier about him. He goes, "You don't know that Krishna's a person, the Supreme Personality? This is all Krishna's. None of it is yours." And then the man was kind of like looking around a little for some moral support to us, and we were all just sitting like that. And then Prabhupada just decided to give that man a huge dose of mercy, and he began by getting heavier and heavier with him and just saying, "You are thinking that you are some professor, let alone some sannyasi." He goes, "But you are a fool." He goes, "You are nonsense. You don't know anything. How can you masquerade yourself as a professor, as a teacher?" He goes, You don't even know the simplest things of Bhagavad Gita." And the man goes, "I've read Bhagavad Gita." And Prabhupada said, "No, you haven't." He goes, "I know for sure that you haven't." He goes, "You don't know the simplest things." He goes, You are a fool, and you are a rascal." And the man goes, he was like extremely shocked. And he kept kind of looking over it. And for some reason he looked at me, I guess just because I was a girl or something. And he was like, and I just kind of like I just kept looking at Prabhupada. And so he kept looking back at Prabhupada, and he had nowhere to go. And so at a certain point, Prabhupada just kind of leaned over and he says, "You are a nonsense and a fool, super fool, and you are a demon. You're a demon." And at that point, the man, something kind of happened where he just broke. And he just went, "Yes, I am demon. I am. Oh, I am a nonsense. I'm a rascal. I'm a demon." And then Prabhupada just kind of looked at him kind of happily, like shook his head like that. And the man went to pay obeisances at Prabhupada's feet in the dirt. And he paid obeisances, and he started to kind of cry. And he said, "I am demon. I am nonsense. I am demon." And he was kind of like doing this kind of kind of like rolling around kind of a little bit by Prabhupada's feet. And then Prabhupada, just like the most magnificent swan or king, he just gently pulled his feet away, stood up, and just walked out of there. Walked out with his head held high, just very regally, and just walked out. And a few of the sannyasis and people left with him. And there was just a couple of us left in there. And we were just stunned. We were watching this man. And he continued. He didn't even realize that Prabhupada was gone. He had his eyes closed, and he was going, "I am demon, demon. I am such a demon." And then after a little while, he kind of realized that, where he was, and he kind of shook himself off from the dirt. He kind of sat up, and he looked around, and he kind of looked at us, and he had this blissful smile on his face. He was kind of smiling like at each of us with this very kind of innocent, beautiful face, and he said, "Jai, Jai, Hare Krishna." And then he walked out the other door. And that was the end of that. And another wonderful experience I had, this was in Los Angeles when we used to clean Srila Prabhupada's quarters. And this was in the later years. I had the privilege of cleaning Srila Prabhupada's bathroom. So I got all the nectar, like we got the eucalyptus twigs, and we used to go around the bathtub ring, and we'd take the bathtub leftover of his mustard seed oil, and that would be a delicacy, which we would take ourselves very greedily and also distribute. And any other little kind of things that were left around in the bathroom. So one day I was cleaning and feeling very blissful, and I was singing and very absorbed. And it had been a kind of a nice morning, but then it had started to rain. But I didn't know that, and Srila Prabhupada came back early. And everybody else seemed to have somehow gotten down those stairs, but I didn't get to go down the stairs. And there was only one way down out of Prabhupada's room, were those stairs. So I was just finishing up the floor of his bathroom, and I realized that I was stuck, and I didn't know where to hide, because I was right on that little landing there. So I kind of squeezed myself into the corner, and I kind of put my head down, and Prabhupada came up the stairs very vigorously. And he was talking to one gentleman, and it was some Indian gentleman, I don't know. I don't recall anything about him. He was just, maybe he'd been on the morning walk. And they were discussing, and at one point, Prabhupada was asking him some questions about Krishna. And I think the man had said something about the sunrise being very beautiful. And then Prabhupada said, yes, it is somewhat beautiful. He goes, but it is Krishna's sunrise. He said, and Krishna is so beautiful. Krishna is so beautiful. And then he just kind of stopped. He was standing there, and he just kind of stopped. He said, even one tiny ray emanating from the tiniest of his tips of his toenails is 1,000,000 times more effulgent and beautiful than anything in this world. And then he was so full of that vision. It was just sitting there in the room. It was very intense. And then he said to the man, you don't know? And then the man said, like, he didn't say anything. And then Prabhupada turned to me, because I guess he had seen me all along, and he said, and I was looking up, and he said, can you see? And I said, no, Srila Prabhupada, I can't see. And then Prabhupada looked at me in this beautiful, deep way, and he said, I want you to see. So that was very special for me. I was in Mayapur, and one day this gentleman, this old Vaishnava, I don't know that he must have been a Gaudiya Vaishnava. Anyway, he came to the Pujari room. He was looking for someone to talk to, and he was holding this Back to Godhead magazine. And he said, is anyone here who is disciple of Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj? And a few of us said, well, we are. He said, oh, I have to tell something really special. And he was very excited. He said, I have been the pujari at Advaita Acharya's house in Shantipur. You know that beautiful house where it's like a temple there now. He said, and for many years I served there in very humble capacity of doing the artiques and taking a little bit care of guests. And he said that many, many, many years ago, when I was young, I used to notice that there was this one Grihasta gentleman that would come, and he would sit in the back of the hall, and in a very sober and quiet way, he had his japa beads, and he would chant japa, and I would notice that he would weep, that he would be weeping, very much weeping. He said, so because of that, I didn't want to disturb him. But I would notice him, and whenever he would come, I would be so happy to see him. My heart would fill with joy. He said, and I would always try and give him some mahaprasadam or some little thing, but I never asked who he was or anything like that. He said he always moved with great determination. And he was came in a very determined way, and he left in a very determined way. Sometimes he would stay almost all afternoon and just chant. And he said, and then after some time, I noticed that he didn't come anymore. He said, I looked for him, but he didn't come. And then he said, after a few years, one day I was doing my seva, and I noticed there was someone sitting in the exact place where he used to sit in the back, who was chanting like him, but he was wearing saffron robes. And he said, I looked quite closely, and I recognized that it was my old friend, the man that I had always watched. And he was chanting in that same way, but even more deeply, and weeping, so much bitterly weeping. He said he was weeping so much that he himself was weeping. And finally, he gathered together some mahaprasadam, and he waited until that sannyasi was finished, and when he was ready to leave, he came up to him and he said, "Here, you remember me? I brought you some Mahaprasadam, and I'm so glad to see you. I didn't recognize you at first. What is your name? Who are you?" He goes, "I've been watching you for so many years. Who are you?" And then that man said, "My name is Abhay Charnaravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj. And I am a humble and very fallen disciple of my most glorious Gurudev, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Thakur Prabhupada." He said, "And the reason that I've been coming here for so many years is because this is the place where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda Prabhu and Advaita Prabhu used to gather to plan the whole worldwide movement of this Sankirtan mission. They would come here together. This is such a holy place." He goes, "So I have been coming here and I've been praying at the dust of this place and at the dust of their feet for their mercy." He said, "Because many years ago, my Gurudev gave me an impossible mission. He ordered me to go across the ocean and somehow plant this Krishna consciousness, this pure Vaishnava Krishna consciousness on that foreign soil. He goes, I am not knowing how to go, and I am coming here and I am praying for them to give me guidance and inspiration." He said, "And I'm feeling great mercy." He said, "But tomorrow I am actually leaving. I am leaving Bharatvarsha. I am going on a ship. I don't know even which direction it's traveling. I'm going. I have no place to turn. I don't know what will happen except that my Gurudev has given me this order, and the personalities of this place have given me their mercy." He said, "Would you also bestow upon me your mercy?" And so that devotee said, he said, "Oh, of course you have any mercy that I have to give." He said, "I pray that you will be successful." And then Prabhupada said, "May we meet again." And then Prabhupada took whatever little bag he had and he walked away. And so we know from history that that was when Prabhupada had come to leave, and he had come and made one visit to Mayapur and had come there also. And then the next day he left on the ship. Then that man told us, he said, "So I never thought again. I wasn't thinking. I saw so many people, but often I would remember him and wonder how had he done, what had happened to him." He said, "And then I started noticing a very strange occurrence, which was these white Vaishnavas started coming to our little temple." He said, "But I was shy of them. I didn't know what to say. I didn't speak any English." He said, "So I didn't speak to them. I didn't even know where they were coming from or how they had possibly become devotees. But then," he said, "one day, one of them came and gave him one of these Back to Godhead magazines. And so he took it and he opened it up, and it was one of those ones where they had serialized Prabhupada's life. And there was this picture of Srila Prabhupada as a grihasta when he lived in Calcutta. And he said, "And I see that that is him, and now I am looking here and I'm seeing that the Acharya, that is also him." He goes, "He has done it, my friend." He goes, "He actually did." He goes, "I am so happy, and I just wanted everyone to know about your Gurudev and his glories." This was told by a very, very old man who I met in Calcutta, the grandfather of a devotee. He's an actual ISKCON devotee, initiated in Calcutta, very sweet, took over the family business, quite an industrialist, with so much love for Srila Prabhupada. And he told me, "Oh, my grandfather met Srila Prabhupada when he was a very young man. And he's always kind of telling us little things, but if you came maybe formally, we could hear the whole story about he and Srila Prabhupada." He says, "But actually he's dying of cancer. He's very, very ill. I don't even know if he'll last even a few more days." So we went there to his house, and I have a picture of each person that I took an interview from, and his picture is very touching. He was like his face was eaten away, and yet he had this exquisitely blissful smile on his face. And so this is what he told. He said that when he was a young man, even in college, not even married or anything yet, now he was very old, and he said that he used to walk in Victoria Park every morning and do his daily constitutional walk. And he said that he noticed after a while that there was another gentleman, a Grihasta gentleman, who was very beautiful and had this quite a nice chadar and wore chappals and very aristocratic, kind of old-fashioned style, Vaishnava. And he used to be walking kind of on the same route as him. So he somehow made friends with him. And they used to take their walks together for some period of some months. And he said he loved this man, and who of course we know is our Srila Prabhupada. And he said he used to always talk to him, and he said that he would try and talk about some mundane things like his business and his school, his family. He said Prabhupada had no interest. He said, actually, I have to tell you. He said, I was born also in a very aristocratic Bengali family, but Krishna has been very kind to me, and somehow or other he has arranged that I would meet my eternal Gurudev. He goes, I have not taken initiation yet. He goes, but I have met him, and not only have I met him and have I given my heart to him, but also he has given me a very, very amazing and difficult order that I should go to the West and spread Krishna consciousness. He said, so now I can never be the same. He said, my life is completely changed. He said, I have wife and I have plans for family and home. And he says, and now I am his servant, his eternal servant. I can't do anything else. And then when they used to walk, at times Prabhupada would preach to him from the Gita and from the Srimad Bhagavatam. And he said he didn't have so much of a mind to hear it, but he just remembered one special thing that Srila Prabhupada said. He said he was always glorifying his Gurudev, and many times weeping when he would discuss about how much he loved him and how much he had changed his life in one conversation, and how he was practicing deeply already that Krishna consciousness that his Gurudev had ordered, and preparing himself, and already beginning to write in English. And so he just said that, he didn't have such mind. He goes, I was Arya Samajam. I was not from pure Vaishnava family. He goes, but I remember one time he told me this quote, and he used to quote it quite often, about how Krishna was just like the sun. And wherever there was any darkness or any fear or anything that wasn't beautiful and pure, then Krishna, the light of Krishna, could change that immediately if one could remember like that. He said he would always remind me. He goes, but I didn't practice so much. He said, but now, here I am. He goes, and for some period of time, I've been suffering terribly because this body is dying. He said, and what amazing thing has been happening to me. And I was telling my grandson, you please bring that person to come and I want to tell about this. He said, is that as I'm lying here, and my doctor would say that I should be in excruciating pain, he said, what I'm seeing is the face of that Srila Prabhupada. He said, I never got to see him again. He goes, I heard what he had done in America and also in India, and I tried to go once to Mayapur, but he was out of station. He goes, I never saw him again. He said, but what I remember, his beautiful face and the way he preached with so much love and the potency of Krishna coming through him. He goes, now that is coming into my heart day and night. He goes, I'm seeing his face. And I am remembering what he said about no fear and no suffering. He goes, and I am feeling very, very blissful. And I am feeling very, very fortunate that he was my friend. That he was a friend to me. So this was told to us by an old gentleman, Vaishnav, who lives just a couple of doors down from Radha Damodar in one of those houses that front on the back. They kind of close in on the back of Rupa Goswami's Samadhi area. His name is Hridayananda Das Babaji. And we found him because the devotee who takes care of Srila Prabhupada's rooms, I asked him to keep an eye out, and he said this old man used to come all the time and cry in front of Prabhupada's murti there. And so we followed him home, and we found out, so we asked him, in his little room. His room was just completely cluttered and full of books, Krishna conscious books. And when we asked him if he had any memories that he could tell us about Srila Prabhupada, he immediately began to weep, just like a baby, just weeping. And then he said, he goes, I've lived in Vrindavan. He says, I'm like 89 years old or something. I've lived in Vrindavan my whole life, and never, ever in my whole years that I've lived here have I seen anyone do sadhana like him. He said, and when I found out that Nityananda Prabhu had chosen him to go and break open the storehouse of love of God in the world, he goes, I wasn't at all surprised. So we said, well, what were those memories? What do you remember? He had a few memories, and the first one was, he said he used to live in that room, and he always lived in that same room. He never moved from that room. And he said he knew that Srila Prabhupada lived nearby him, and he always saw him going in and out of Radha Damodar and saw him going on parikrama around Vrindavan, but he was very grave. Prabhupada was very grave, he said, and very not social, just very walking and chanting. And he said even when he used to go to Radha Damodar sometimes to do parikrama, Srila Prabhupada would be either on the veranda there or in his rooms just writing and chanting, and he never wanted to disturb him. So he knew who he was, but didn't ever spoken with him or anything. And he noticed that some evenings in the middle of the night, not evening, but in the middle of the night, he would hear this voice coming from the courtyard of Rupa Goswami's Samadhi. And it would be like a crying voice, calling out, kind of in this very pathetic tone. And it would go for quite a while in the night. But he said he was usually sleeping and he didn't go to investigate what it was. And he heard it quite regularly. And then he said one night he heard that again, and it was a full moon, and he wasn't that sleepy, and he decided to go up the stairs and go up to the roof. And so he was standing on the roof in the middle of the night, and he was looking down into the courtyard. And what he saw by Rupa Goswami's Bhajan Kutir and Samadhi was, he saw our Srila Prabhupada, and he was bending down in front of the Samadhi, and he had a broom, like a broom made out of straw. And he was sweeping there in that courtyard, and as he was sweeping, he was crying. And he was calling out, "Hey Gurudev, hey Gurudev, give me your mercy, give me your mercy. Hey Rup, hey Sanatan, give me your mercy, please give me your mercy. Without your mercy, how can I do what you have asked me to do?" And he said then he realized that all those times that he had heard that in the middle of the night, that was our Srila Prabhupada performing one aspect of his sadhana there, in that very special place for him. And then he told another very sweet story. He said that then after that he became attracted to Srila Prabhupada, and he used to come over sometimes and try and figure out ways of getting to listen to him telling nectar and Harikatha. He said Prabhupada would sit out there with some very senior and elder kind of Vaishnavas and Brijbasis, and they would discuss Krishna consciousness. But it wasn't just that anyone could come, so he would kind of sneak around and try and listen. And Prabhupada noticed that he was sincere, but he used to try and do service for Srila Prabhupada, but he said Srila Prabhupada wouldn't take any service from anyone. Like he would say, "Oh, please let me just do this, let me take out your trash, let me do this," and Prabhupada wouldn't, no need. And but he said one day Srila Prabhupada used to go every day out in the afternoon to the Yamuna. And he said that one day when just as he was leaving, he said, "Oh, Prabhupada, could I just clean up your room a little bit?" And so Srila Prabhupada said, all right, I'll be back shortly." And so he left, and so when he was gone, then this man, he started like cleaning and sweeping the room, and he was getting very enthusiastic. And then he looked up at the ceiling and he saw that there was these cobwebs there. And so he said, "I'm going to clean the cobwebs as well." So he started sweeping the cobwebs, and he was very enthusiastic, thinking that this room will never be like this is so nice and clean. And then when he was finished, he realized that Srila Prabhupada was coming back any moment. And he looked down on the floor and he noticed that there was these little spiders, and they were just kind of wandering around aimlessly and bewildered. And then he kind of thought, uh-oh, maybe I did something wrong. And just when he thought that, Prabhupada came right into the room, and immediately Prabhupada looked on the floor and he saw the spiders, and then he looked up and he saw the no cobwebs, and then he looked at him with fierce eyes. He said, "Why have you disturbed? What have you done?" And he went, "Oh, I just thought maybe I did do something wrong. I was just trying to clean." He goes, "I'll pick them up and I'll put them back on the wall." And then Srila Prabhupada said, These living entities, they are Brijbasis. He goes, "They have been here for countless generations, taking the shelter of Vrindavan, and they're not causing any disturbance to anyone. And then we come." He goes, "We're newcomers, we're interlopers, and then we disturb. We make so much disturbance." He said, "Please don't do that anymore." He said, "Or we will get offense in the Dham." And so this old man, while he was telling that story, he pointed around his room and there was thousands of cobwebs everywhere. He said, "I am never disturbing anything. I'm always remembering Swami Maharaj's instructions to me." He goes, "I am very blissful." He goes, "Even snake or rat come," he goes, "I will not disturb. They are welcome." So that was very sweet. He also told how Srila Prabhupada, and I heard this from several people, how even in the heat of summer, Srila Prabhupada would go on parikrama, and he would go to Yamuna, and he would have a kirtan by himself. I don't know how he did it. He had the kartals or somehow tied to one piece with his danda, and he would go to Yamuna, and he would just have this very sweet kirtan. And a lot of times, like the little boys and different people would come and follow him. And he said sometimes, even in the middle of the hot summer, when Yamuna was mostly dried up, Srila Prabhupada would cross over the shallow part and he would go into where the islands were, and he would stick his danda into the sand, and he would do parikrama, dancing and chanting and singing. Very, very exceedingly blissful, and many people came and joined. It became quite a popular thing in Vrindavan. Yeah, around the danda, yeah. He said he joined several times. One godbrother of Srila Prabhupada's, who was named Nayananda Das Babaji, lived at Champahata, which is in Navadvip. And there's a beautiful Gorgadadhar temple there. And it's the place where Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati used to camp on their Gauromandala Parikrama. And so he told some very beautiful memories about Srila Prabhupada, which I'll recall. He said when he was a young brahmachari, Srila Prabhupada was a grihasta in Calcutta, and Srila Prabhupada had a house there, which we know of at Sitakanta Banerjee Lane. And he said that Srila Prabhupada was so humble and so generous and hospitable that whenever there were any brahmacharis from any other godbrothers or any mats or anyone who was preaching in Calcutta from the Dham, Prabhupada had an open door policy that anybody could come to his house, and he had the door open, he didn't lock it. And they would just come knocking on the door, and Prabhupada would, if he was in his room, he would give them his room. And then he would go into the living room and he would take rest. And when they woke up in the morning, he had already done all the seva and everything for his pictures and his, I think he had little deities. And then he would make prasadam for everyone. So he knew him from that capacity by staying there several times. So he said that because he knew him and loved him, he was always keeping an eye and watching him. And he said even though Srila Prabhupada acted like just a grihasta, who he wasn't living in the mat, he wasn't one of the big, leaders or anything like that, but he had a great respect from many people, especially because he was so humble. And he used to pay obeisances even to the young brahmacharis just because they wore saffron, even though in every other capacity he was senior to them. And he also paid obeisances to anyone who had been initiated before him because he waited those 11 years out of humility. So he said one time he saw a very amazing thing. It was one year when they were at Gauromandala Parikrama, and he said that he was visiting there, his Gurudev, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, that balcony that he had where he used to pace back and forth, Prabhupada told us, and plan out how to, the Krishna consciousness movement and like a warrior king. And he said so he had been out there having a darshan with all the big sannyasis and brahmacharis were there, and he was also there. And he said that just then he finished the darshan and he went into his room and closed the door. And everyone was still sitting out there. And he said just at that moment he noticed this very quiet grihasta coming from, the front gates and coming up, walking up towards where, in the back where the house was. and kind of looking around, and he was carrying a suitcase. Probably had just come off the train, he said. And he recognized that it was his friend, Abhay Charan Aravinda Babu, they used to call him Prabhu. And he saw him, and he was kind of looking around, and then he started to very quietly walk up the stairs. But then he saw that actually his Gurudev wasn't there, and that the darshan was over, and someone said, darshan is over. And so in a very kind of, again, non-invasive way, he just turned around and started, he went like this, gave respects to everyone, and he started walking back down the stairs. And he walked down the stairs, and he was just walking out towards the main temple. And just at that moment, the doors flung open, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur Prabhupada was standing there. And he looked over, and he saw our Srila Prabhupada walking. And then he said, oh, come, like that. And everyone was kind of looking, what? And Prabhupada himself even looked. And then he saw that his Gurudev was calling him. So he came and he started walking back up the stairs. And all the sannyasis were crowded around the door. They thought maybe it was more of a darshan. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati went like this. And he kind of made a path between them all. And he called for Srila Prabhupada to come there. And then he brought him into his room, and he closed the door. And Nayananda Das Babaji, who at that time was a brahmachari, said that everyone was very amazed. Even he himself was amazed, but especially the sannyasis who were saying, well, who is he? Why is Gurudev letting him come like that? We haven't seen like that. And we want to go in the room too. And there was a little bit of muttering. But he said he noticed, and he was watching on his clock, on his watch, that he was in there for quite a period of time. Very quiet. No one said anything. And then, just after that, the door opened, and he came out. Our Srila Prabhupada came out. In a very sweet way, he paid respects to each person, like by looking them in the eye and paying respect, looked him in the eye, and then he took his suitcase, and he just quietly walked back down the stairs. Because he had seen that, then he knew that there was something special going on, so he was always keeping his eye on Srila Prabhupada. So he said that this was the last year of the parikrama, the last year that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati conducted that before he left this world. And it was the last evening, and somehow that morning, we think it was Ban Maharaj, who had come back from England. And he had come on a boat, and then he had entered in and come to Navadvip, and apparently met with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. So everyone knew about it, and everybody was kind of interested in what had happened, because in those days the communications weren't so good. And so this devotee noticed that that evening, when their Guru Maharaj was going to give the lecture, there was thousands and thousands of people at Champahata. They were all, first of all, there was tents everywhere. And then all the devotees and all the pilgrims were crowded close in to hear, under this big pandal, to hear the last lecture of that parikrama. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati stood up there on the podium in a very beautiful way, and he began to speak. This is from the memory of Nayananda Das Babaji. He began to speak about how much it was his deep and sincere desire that this Krishna consciousness would go across the ocean, and that it would go to the West, and it would save the world. And he began by speaking about his guru, his father, Srila Bhaktivedanta Thakur. And he began saying how he had had this vision, and how he had always told him about this vision in very clear terms, and had imposed upon him that this vision, you may have to, take on this vision. If not, I'm trying, I'm sending my books, I'm doing, but this will definitely come to pass. But, you must make it part of your sincerest service. And then he told how he had tried to do that so far, and he had sent out some disciples to London, and had tried to send them with Lakshmi, and that Lakshmi had come from the blood of the Gaudiya Math, from the brahmacharis who had gone out for paisas collecting. And somehow or other, still after several attempts, it was not successful. And then he told about his mother, Bhagavati Devi, And he said, when my mother was leaving from this world, she called me to her bedside and she gave me one order upon my head. She said, your father, he wanted very much that this Krishna consciousness would be exploding everywhere in the Western countries, that it would become so much popular in every town and village. He wanted this and it hasn't yet come to pass, so you do it. So then he spoke out to his audience of disciples and followers and he said, so I am beseeching you, this is the order upon my head. He said, and I'm asking each and every one of you to also make it your service as well. But then he did something very amazing. He started to scan the audience. And Nayananda Das Babaji said that he was very far on this side of the audience, but he noticed that behind him was our Srila Prabhupada, who was then still a Grihasta. And he noticed it because he had waved to him and everything. And he was behind him, though, and to the side. So he said that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada started just looking in the audience very deeply like this. And then when he got over to that side, he stopped. And almost like a radar, he just started staring. And at first, Nayananda Das Babaji thought he was looking at him. And so he kind of went, and then he realized, no, it wasn't me. And he looked behind him and he saw. And he said he thinks he was maybe the only person that saw because he knew that personality of our Srila Prabhupada. He said he saw that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's vision, his eyes, were locked with our Srila Prabhupada's in a very deep, deep glance with each other. He said it was so deep you could almost cut it. And then he said that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada then turned and he looked back into the center and he said the whole front was filled with saffron and all the sannyasis and all the great preachers and everything. And he said, but he goes, I have a prediction. He said, I want to make one prediction. He said, I predict that the next one of my disciples who travels across the ocean, however long in the future that may take, that disciple, he'll bring back the whole world. He heard someone calling out his name, Abhay Charnaravinda. But he was already a sannyasi, so he didn't use that name anymore. And so he was thinking, who's calling me like that in the middle of the night? So he didn't get up at first, he was just writing, and then later he kept hearing that voice, so he went out and he went into the courtyard of the deities, but he didn't. Then he heard the voice coming from by where the samadhi of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati is. And so he paid obeisances at the different samadhis, and then he was paying obeisance at his Gurudev's samadhi, and then he had some Swarti darshan of Srila Prabhupada, Bhaktisiddhanta, wherein Srila Prabhupada asked him, I am calling you? He goes, but why are you still here? I've asked you to go to... he goes, I've asked you to go to the West. Why you haven't gone? And then Prabhupada said something like, well, I'm trying so hard to go. And then his guru said, why do you think I have named you Abhay Charnaravinda? Because you are fearless, because you have taken shelter at the lotus feet of Krishna. So don't worry. He goes, it's all been arranged. You just go. And then Prabhupada said something like, but I'm not seeing the path yet. I'm not seeing a facility. It hasn't come. And then Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said something like, I have the exact words here, something like, he goes, don't you know that it's already all been arranged? He goes, for so long, across the ocean, there are so many of them, and they have been calling for you, and they have been crying for you. So you must go. Now is the time. Now is the time. He says, so just begin. Don't even hesitate. Just begin, and it will be revealed to you how to go. So apparently right after that, Srila Prabhupada packed up from Vrindavan, and he went to Delhi, and he used to go in this very humble, kind of like a beggar, like a sannyasi beggar way. He would go to all these Arya Samajam and just different groups and civic groups, and he would speak and say, my Guru Maharaj has given me this mission. And he has told me that somehow or other it's been arranged. So I'm just waiting to find the person who he has talked about, who's helping to arrange this. So if there's anyone in this audience, you please come. And so that was when he met the secretary for Sumati Maraji. And he gave him a letter of introduction, and then he went to Bombay. This I heard at both. I heard from some devotees from Saraswat Mat and from Devananda Gaudiya Mat that when Srila Prabhupada came back, I think it was the first time. Yeah, the first time when he just had, what was the name of that devotee? Ramanuja, and maybe it was Achyutananda with him. And so he visited both of his old friends, Srila Keshava Maharaj and Srila Sridhar Maharaj. And he brought that reel-to-reel tape recorder too, and he had it blaring really loud. And the devotees would come from far and wide and just mesmerized. They would just be stunned and crying and amazed that this was really true, that it actually had happened. And so that first evening that he came back at Devananda Gaudiya Mat, he told when he gave that lecture that night, and many people who were brahmacharis then and now sannyasis remembered that, what he spoke. They said that he spoke about his preaching in the West and how it had happened and how he had started it, and how at first he had tried so many different ways to preach to this kind of audience and that kind of audience, but then it became clear that it was the young people who were wandering aimlessly, bewildered and disenfranchised from their families, who Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had his eye on. And he said that he began to sing in the park, and he said that it was so awful what he saw going on in the park that he would close his eyes and just chant very, very deeply and meditate on Nityananda Prabhu and the mercy that was coming. And then he goes, so first 1 or 2 came, and then 5, and then 10, and 20, and 100, and 200. He goes, and now it's a waterfall of them coming. He goes, but in the beginning, each and every one of those jivas, those young boys and girls from the wealthiest country of America, I had to drag them with my own hands out of the gutter. Before Srila Bhakti Kamal Madhusudan Maharaj took sannyas, his name was Narottamananda Das Brahmachari, and he was well known in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's preaching force as one of the great preachers. He was a young boy, very beautiful and very enthusiastic, and traveled all over India, used to convert whole towns and villages, to bring them to his guru. So he was well known as one of the fiery, successful preachers. So he told this memory that one time he was in Bombay, and they had a little Gaudiya Mat there. Actually, Srila Prabhupada helped in establishing that in some ways, along with Srila Sridhar Maharaj. And when he used to go to Bombay, he was very active in that. And so at that time, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Prabhupada came for a darshan, for a visit to that little temple. And they were sitting down all together like an Ishtagosi kind of thing with the godbrothers there, the disciples. And Srila Sridhar Maharaj was there, and Narottamananda Das Babaji Maharaj was there. Several other strong preachers. I think what's his name? Bhakti Saranga Goswami Maharaj also was there. And our Srila Prabhupada as Abhay Aravinda Prabhu was there. So they were talking with their Guru Maharaj, and he was again speaking about this order to go to the West. So in quite a strong way, he was saying, so I have ordered, and I want, who here will go? I'm wanting someone very strong preacher, one of our strong preachers to go. So he turned to Srila Sridhar Maharaj and he said, so you are topmost, of our scholars and very senior. You can go to the West, you're qualified. And then in a very humble way, Srila Sridhar Maharaj explained, the exact words are written, but I don't have them, how his nature was not so much forward-going, but more, how did he say? Reserved. And also he he couldn't so much understand the inflection of the Westerners and in their English, because they were used to very proper British English, and we were, like Americans, and so he wasn't sure he could do like that, and so he was just saying, I don't know if I can do like that. And then their Guru Maharaj turned to this Narottam Das Brahmachari, and he said, "Oh, so you go." He goes, "You are a very active preacher. You have been so much success everywhere. I am hearing about this many people, taking Harinam, and so many people by your hand. So I want you to go." And so then Narottam Das Brahmachari, he began to, he fell down at his Gurudev's feet and he began to weep. And he said, "Oh, Gurudev, please don't ask me to go. He goes, I'm just a little boy. I'm just so young. I'm like your son. If I had to go away to the West all by myself, I would die. I would die of missing you. I don't have the strength. It's not in my capacity to do it." He said, and then Gurudev was kind of like rubbing his head, and he said, oh, don't think like that, don't worry. He said, no, please. He goes, "And if you give me that order and I fail, then I will fall down forever. I couldn't please you." He goes, "But here I know I can please you. But there I don't think." And he was weeping like a little baby. He was telling his disciple. And so then Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was embracing him with love. And then he said, he looked up, and then he looked over at across the table where our Srila Prabhupada was sitting, and he said, "Anyway, no worry. No one need to worry." He goes, "Abhay Babu, he will do it." So that devotee remembered that very deeply, and he said he never forgot that. And so when it actually happened, he had one more realization of his Gurudev's omniscience and also of Srila Prabhupada's potency. Srila Prabhupada and Srila Bhakti Pramod Puri Maharaj weren't all very much, had service together in the early days. They were both editing different literatures of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and they preached in different areas. And then after the breakup of the Gaudiya Math, Srila Puri Maharaj became like a Kinchana Babaji. And for many years he traveled with Krishnadas Babaji and around Vrindavan, and just had a pot and japa mala beads, and was very brahmachari still, and very humble. But he had actually been very close to their Guru Maharaj as well, as both a pujari, his personal pujari, and as a singer. He was a very beautiful kirtaniya. So apparently when Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was leaving from this world, there's some history that he asked Srila Sridhar Maharaj to sing for him Sri Rupa Manjari Pada. And some of the other devotees wanted Puri Maharaj, who was then a brahmachari, to sing. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati asked Srila Sridhar Maharaj to sing. And so also, when Srila Prabhupada was just, when he had first come back from America, he brought a few devotees with him, and he would invite some of his different godbrothers to come, and he would try and explain to them what was happening, this amazing revolution of Krishna consciousness that was happening. And he brought this reel-to-reel tape recorder that had all the devotees on Harinam Sankirtan singing, so they could hear all the different voices, and Prabhupada played it quite loudly. And so at one point in Mayapur, there were several occasions that they met and discussed, but at that time Puri Maharaj wasn't preaching as much as he was chanting a lot and wandering like a mendicant. But at one point, I think he took sannyas, and he was beginning to get a following. And he went to Mayapur to see Srila Prabhupada, and at that time Srila Prabhupada offered, he wanted to offer some Mahaprasadam to him with some water. But he gave it to him through the hands of one of the Western disciples, who, not knowing proper sadachar and etiquette, touched it to his hand to his mouth first, and then just kind of handed it. And so Puri Maharaj, he couldn't do it. He just wasn't able to, because he was from a very, very high class Brahmin family, never had taken anything like that, and so he declined. And one other little bit of information to be known, which is in the Prabhupada letter book, and which Srila Puri Maharaj himself told me that he was very glad that everyone knew about this letter was that at one point he actually he was preaching in Bengal and he got a temple donated, like a mandir donated by some king. And but it was dilapidated and he had no funds and no man to help. And he had seen how Prabhupada was developing Bombay and Mayapur and Vrindavan, and so he wrote one letter to our Srila Prabhupada saying, I am also now starting to preach and I have one temple and I'm seeing the wonderful preaching that you're doing, and I'm hoping that you might give one donation to help me with my work. And so the letter is actually on file and anyone can find it. The gist of it being that Srila Prabhupada said, it's very wonderful that you are preaching like this. Our Gurudev wanted this very much. He said, and I would be so much happy to make any donation, of Lakshmi to you. But he said, I know that you are very, very high class and Pakka Brahmin, and this Lakshmi has come through the hands of the Malechas. And therefore I think it would be impossible for you to accept it because it's contaminated. So Srila Prabhupada, even when he was telling me about the letter, I nodded that I knew about the letter, and he laughed in a very sweet way. Then he said something very beautiful. He said, your Gurudev has given me a very great gift, a very great gift. But in order to explain that very great gift, I need to tell about the last meeting between the two of them that took place in Vrindavan some couple weeks before Srila Prabhupada departed, maybe a little longer, when Srila Prabhupada was calling in the different godbrothers and in a very meek and humble way apologizing if he had caused any offenses during his preaching. And of course Srila Puri Maharaj said, oh no, you have not caused any offense. If anyone has, it would have been us. And then Prabhupada said, I am leaving soon from this world. He said, I am going from this world. He said, and I want to know if you would give me a gift, like a loving Vaishnava gift. And Puri Maharaj said, yes, Maharaj, anything, whatever you want. And Srila Prabhupada said, I am leaving soon, and I wanted to go on parikrama of Govardhan and Vrindavan Dham, Braj Mandala. He goes, I wanted to go on this parikrama, but I've not been able to go. He said, and I remember when our Guru Maharaj was leaving from this world, and you wanted to sing for him, but you weren't able. He said, so would you sing for me now? He goes, would you sing Jaya Radhe, Jaya Krishna, Jaya Vrindavan? He goes, and then I will go on parikrama. So Prabhupada closed his eyes, and Srila Puri Maharaj closed his eyes, and he sang that. And Prabhupada went on parikrama. And tears were dripping from his eyes, both of their eyes, very, very sweetly. And then, when that was over, after a little while, then Srila Prabhupada said, oh, my dear godbrother, he goes, now I'd like to know if I can give you a gift. So Puri Maharaj said, yes, Maharaj, anything, whatever you do, give, I will take. So Prabhupada whispered over to one of his servants, and in a few moments he came back carrying a plate of Mahaprasadam from Krishna and Balaram, from Radhashama Sundar. And that boy started to hand it to Puri Maharaj, and then Prabhupada put his own hand on there as well, and he said, please don't be shy to take. I am touching with my own hand. You please take. So Puri Maharaj said that it was halava, and he just took some halava, and he said that when he took that halava, so much mercy came into his heart, so much deep, deep realizations and mercy. And so now I'll tell you what he said to me. Because he couldn't speak so well, they had been giving him oxygen and everything, but he wanted to say this, and even though they had been trying to block anyone from coming in the room, when he found out that he wanted this to be known in the world, first he just started to weep, and he was rubbing my head and saying, oh, your Guru Maharaj is so wonderful. He is so doyal, he is so mercy. He said, you are so fortunate. Because he pleased our Guru Maharaj more than anyone could ever imagine. Oh, how he pleased him. And then he said, and he also gave some mercy to me. He said, he helped me in a very special way by his gifts. He said, and because of those gifts, I also was able to do some little service in this regard of my Gurudev's desire to spread Krishna consciousness all over the world. He said he did everything, but I got to do some little only because of his mercy. He said he taught me that all jivas, no matter what their birth and their disqualification, are qualified to take Krishna consciousness. He said all jivas. Doesn't have to be Brahmin, doesn't have to be from India. He said he taught me that by his special agency of his gifts. And then he began to weep and weep. And then he was just going, Doyal, Doyal, his mercy, his mercy. There's some very beautiful stories about Srila Sridhar Maharaj and Srila Prabhupada. One was told to me by one servant of his, Srila Sridhar Maharaj, is that when Srila Prabhupada first came back from America, he had written one telegram to Sridhar Maharaj that he would be coming on this so-and-so day, but he didn't say when or what train. So the servant noticed that Sridhar Maharaj, all day he was highly excited and walking up and down on his balcony and waiting and looking and craning his eyes, not taking prasadam or anything, just waiting. And apparently sometime in the late afternoon, they heard a creaking at the gate, and Prabhupada came with one or two young boys with him, and Westerners, carrying their luggage. They had just gotten off of one rickshaw. And they came to the gate, and Prabhupada opened the gate. And when he saw Srila Sridhar Maharaj on the balcony, because he could see, he dropped his suitcases, and he began to run towards the stairway. And then Srila Sridhar Maharaj also began to run down the stairway. And then they both ran as fast as they could, and when they met in the middle somewhere, they grabbed each other, and then they started going for touching each other's feet, and who could touch each other's feet, and then they were just touching each other's feet and holding each other's feet and weeping and embracing each other. So there was some beautiful friendship there. This is a memory told to me by Srila Govinda Maharaj, the Acharya after Srila Sridhar Maharaj of the Chaitanya Saraswat Math in Navadvip. And he was a young boy at that time, a student of Sanskrit. And Srila Prabhupada had that house that we talked about at Sita Kanta Banerjee Lane in Calcutta. But he also had next door to that, it was like a little bit of a duplex, long buildings, narrow buildings. He had his pharmaceutical company there where he used to make up his formulas and do his business. And above that was a little two-room kind of apartment where he had given that to Srila Sridhar Maharaj as a Gaudiya Math. And whenever Srila Sridhar Maharaj came from Navadvip, they would have programs then. If Srila Prabhupada knew so many people in Calcutta, he would organize all these programs. Srila Sridhar Maharaj didn't like to come to Calcutta, but Prabhupada would often beg him, and he would say, "Oh, he's pulling me, I don't want to go." And Prabhupada would always plan these big programs. So Govinda Maharaj at that time was a brahmachari, wearing saffron, but he said he didn't know anything. And he was just a student. But Srila Sridhar Maharaj, when he would leave, he would ask Srila Prabhupada to give him classes in English in his Bhagavad Gita as it is, because Srila Prabhupada at that time, I guess, was working on that. And so he said he got to be the first student because he couldn't understand anything hardly. But he said Prabhupada would give these very beautiful long lectures, and he was trying to learn English as well. And he said that actually he helped him in that way because he was such a wonderful teacher. But he said that whenever Srila Sridhar Maharaj would come, then Srila Prabhupada would become quite excited. And as soon as he did his morning program at his house with this family who wasn't interested as much, he would come next door. And then he and Srila Sridhar Maharaj would sit there and they would begin to have Bhagavatam class. And they would start out and they would keep going and going in this full nectar of just more and more Krishna Katha and, beautiful philosophical, deep discussions. And they were both so absorbed that sometimes the whole morning and even part of the afternoon would go by. And Prabhupada, many days, never even got around to opening his pharmaceutical business because they were too absorbed in Krishna consciousness. And Govinda Maharaj said that he didn't used to like that so much because he didn't get prasadam. And he would just be sitting there kind of nervously and waiting for them to be finished so he could eat. But he said they would be so oblivious, neither of them even cared for food or water. They would just be, talking with Harikatha. And then he said at one point, he would be like nervous and making these squirming faces. And then he said that Srila Prabhupada, in a very fatherly way, would look to him and say, "Oh, Govinda, here." And he'd come and he'd hand him a little Mahaprasadam and say, "You okay now? You're just a boy. You need to eat." And then they would go on with the Harikatha. And also Srila Prabhupada used to organize all sorts of programs in Calcutta between, the family that he lived in, which was a huge extended family between the Days and the Mullicks and, all of these different in-laws. He knew many, many people, including people from his business. So he would set up these Namahata programs, and he would organize everything. He would invite all the people, he'd make sure they came, he called, he brought all the books, he had all the bhajans ready, he brought the prasadam, he organized everything. And then he would try and pull Srila Sridhar Maharaj to come to be the speaker, because he was older and he was saffron, in a renunciate. Because in those days, people didn't so much respect a grihasta. So Prabhupada knew this well, and so when he would get Srila Sridhar Maharaj, he would be very glad. But when he couldn't get Srila Sridhar Maharaj, either he wasn't there or he couldn't see at night so well he didn't want to come, then he would drag Govinda Maharaj there, who was just a little young brahmachari, and he said, "I was terrified." He goes, "I didn't know anything." He goes, "I barely knew the songs." But he would sit me up on the little Vyasasan seat, and he would make me say the prayers, the invocation prayers. So he said, I would say those prayers, the Mangalacharam prayers. And he said, and then I would start looking around desperately, like panicking that I couldn't say anything more. He goes, but very gracefully and very masterfully, he said, Srila Prabhupada would continue the rest of the whole lecture from the floor where he sat. And he would mesmerize everyone, and people forgot completely that it was coming from a grihasta sitting on the floor. The wife's name is Krishna Dasi, Srimati Krishna Dasi, and the husband's name is Sriman Om Prakash Saini. And they just happened to be very fortunate to live next door to where Srila Prabhupada stationed himself when he lived in Jhansi, when he was trying to start that temple at the Radha Memorial. So this man tells an amazing memories about how Srila Prabhupada was so enthusiastic, even when he was first just coming to Jhansi. He stayed with this gentleman who was a Shastri, and they were next door neighbors, so that's how they knew him. And they said right from the beginning he had this idea to preach in Jhansi. He was very potent, and he was having a deity made in Navadvip, a very beautiful Mahaprabhu deity, and he would tell them about it. And but his real vision was to start a temple there, the League of Devotees. So the old Shastri man, he didn't have so much facility. He was a professor, but he didn't have a car or anything like that. And so he introduced Srila Prabhupada to this young couple. Well, the wife, she immediately liked Srila Prabhupada. She was a bhaktin, and she loved Krishna. Although they both mentioned to Srila Prabhupada that actually Jhansi was not the greatest choice for him as a Krishna bhakta, because most people were actually Ram bhaktas. And they were Sanskrit, and they were a little not so much receptive to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's chanting and dancing in the streets and things like that. But Srila Prabhupada didn't care. He was intent to do it. So he came there, and his roommate, the man he was living with, asked this Mr. Saini, who was just a young, newly married young man, if he would somehow or other help Srila Prabhupada by taking him around and showing him Jhansi. So he was thinking, because he was like a person who loved his city, he was thinking, oh, very nice, I know everything about Jhansi. So first he rented a Tunga, and so he was taking Prabhupada around and showing him this historical site and this nice building. But he said he noticed that Prabhupada was not at all interested in so much of that, although he was polite. But he just kept saying, what about that building? And what about that building? Who owns that? And who owns that? And finally, he began to realize that what Srila Prabhupada was looking for was a temple. So after that, Srila Prabhupada used to kind of request him, would you please take me again? But he said all he had was his bicycle. So Srila Prabhupada went on the back of his bicycle, and they would tool around town. And Prabhupada would make him stop at every single memorial or any kind of old temple or any kind of building that might be suitable for the League of Devotees. And Prabhupada would make him not only take him there, but he would make him research who was the proprietor, and then he would make an appointment for him, and then Prabhupada would go there and try and discuss taking this buildings. So he actually participated in the what turned out not to be so much successful, where Srila Prabhupada tried for that memorial, Radha Memorial. But he just said he had never seen anyone so much dedicated and so much determined, not even for a moment being daunted by huge amounts of obstacles, including the fact that he had nobody to help him, he had no money, he had no connections in this town, hardly at all. But still, he was enthusiastic, and he preached very beautiful. He said he himself had no interest in anything about Vaishnavism, and he said he didn't even really like to hear. He would tell him, please don't preach to me. He said, but Prabhupada would continue to preach to him anyway, and tell him, he said he would start with things about Ram, and he'd get a little interested, and then Srila Prabhupada would just go right into Krishna and Radha and Krishna and very beautiful things. And he said that he would always complain to him, please don't. He goes, I'll help you, but don't make me listen. He said, I'm a young man. I have my whole life in front of me. I'm just married. I have this beautiful wife, and I want to have a big business. He goes, I don't want to listen to that because I don't want to have to become a Vaishnava. I don't want to be a mendicant. He says, so please don't. And I have no interest as well. He goes, I don't like to hear about it. But he said, Prabhupada with this sweet smile would say, oh no, you will chant Hare Krishna. Someday soon you will have to chant Hare Krishna. And he would go, no, no. And Prabhupada would say, yes, yes, I know it's true. He goes, I know it is very true. You will chant Hare Krishna. Meanwhile, Srila Prabhupada was cultivating his wife in such a sweet way that his wife would be inviting him over all the time on the ploy of taking pulse for giving Ayurvedic medicine. But then she would start asking questions about Krishna, and Prabhupada would just preach and preach for hours about Krishna Lila and Ram Lila and very beautiful, beautiful Krishna consciousness, such that his wife was already ready to be a devotee, a full-scale devotee. But then, when everything kind of fell apart there, and Srila Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj and all the devotees came, and they realized that, Prabhupada realized that that wasn't going to work, and so they invited him to come back to Mathura. So he went back. He waited a few days, and then he took that beautiful deity that he had actually made, the first deity that he had ever made, which is such a beautiful Mahaprabhu, and he brought it back there. But before he left, he came and he said goodbye to them. And he was very sad. He said, this was my first preaching. I had a plan, but Krishna must have some other plan. He said, but you are part of my plan. He said, I know that you will take to Krishna consciousness. Don't forget anything that I've said. So these devotees, I just saw them this last year in Vrindavan. The wife comes all the time to everything. She's very enthusiastic. She dances Brijbasi dances, and she sings, and she preaches. She's very strong. And one time at Srila Prabhupada's disappearance day, I was kind of alone in kind of a quiet place, just feeling separation from Srila Prabhupada. And I had my eyes closed, and all of a sudden I felt myself being lifted up. And she's quite a large lady, and I realized, suddenly I looked and I was on her lap, and she was holding me, and she was rubbing me, and she was saying, oh, Prabhupada, Prabhupada, and she was crying. And what finally happened is, some years later, some devotees came through, some Gaudiya Math devotees came through that town of Jhansi, and somehow or other they met her husband who brought them home, and then they just surrendered. And she said that the first thing the devotee said is, oh, you have to chant Hare Krishna. And he said as soon as he heard that, he remembered Srila Prabhupada and all his beauty and stuff. He said, we never saw him again. But he changed our whole lives 100% and completely. He said he did what nobody could do to change me into a devotee. And I owe my whole life to him. So that was very sweet. He also told how Srila Prabhupada, and I heard this from several people, how even in the heat of summer, Srila Prabhupada would go on parikrama, and he would go to Yamuna, and he would have a kirtan by himself. I don't know how he did it. He had the kartals or somehow tied to one piece with his danda, and he would go to Yamuna, and he would just have this very sweet kirtan. And a lot of times, like the little boys and different people would come and follow him. And he said sometimes, even in the middle of the hot summer, when Yamuna was mostly dried up, Srila Prabhupada would cross over the shallow part, and he would go into where the islands were, and he would stick his danda into the sand, and he would do parikrama, dancing and chanting and singing. Very, very exceedingly blissful, and many people came and joined. It became quite a popular thing in Vrindavan. Yeah, around the danda, yeah. He said he joined several times. This is one very sweet memory that some brahmacharis told me about Srila Prabhupada in Delhi. They said that Srila Prabhupada, he used to come to Delhi a lot when he was trying to print the Srimad Bhagavatams. Oh, remind me to tell that other story about the Sanskrit scholars and the Bhagavatams. So he said that Srila Prabhupada was so determined, no one had ever seen such determination. He would go on the train in the morning in the boiling hot. He would do all this canvassing to try and find enough paper just to do a few chapters of the book. He would go around to all these different civic organizations and different kinds of Arya Samajams, and he would ask people to help him in his mission, that his Gurudev had ordered him to go to the West and to print these books in English. So he would do like this, just, he had his own program and his own plan, and he did it all the time, very, very deeply. So he said that one day he was walking in the hot sun, in the Delhi sun in the summer, and he said that he walked by, he was on his way to buy some things in the market, and he saw Srila Prabhupada. He was on a rickshaw, yeah, but he saw Srila Prabhupada standing by the gate of one very rich household. And so he kind of stopped and he said, "Oh, what are you doing here? What are you standing here for? It's hot." And Prabhupada said, "Yes." He says, "But I am waiting for one gentleman to come. He has promised me one donation for my books." And he said, "Oh, well, why don't you come back later in the evening or something? It's so hot. I don't know how you can stand here." And Prabhupada said, No, it's all right. Go ahead. Go on. I will do well." So he said, "Well, couldn't I give you some donation instead?" Because he felt so bad. And he said, "Could I give you some donation?" And Prabhupada said, "How much?" And he said, "Well, how much are you going to get from this donor?" And he said, "He has promised me 5 rupees. And then he said, "All right, I will give you 10 rupees. And then Prabhupada said, "That's very nice. Will you give it every month?" And he said, "Yes, all right, I'll give it every month, but don't stand here in the heat." And Prabhupada said, No, you go do your things on the thing. I'll just wait a little while longer." So when he came back a little later, still the man hadn't come, and Prabhupada was standing at the gate. And he said, "Please, Swami Maharaj, please don't stand there at that gate. What else do you need?" And he said he noticed that Srila Prabhupada, his dhoti was torn, and he was just, oblivious of those kinds of things, and he was carrying this big stack of this heavy paper and stuff, all of his manuscript forms. And he said, "Well, all right, I'll buy you a new dhoti and a shirt, a kurta. And Prabhupada said, "All right." And he said, "You come back with us." And Prabhupada said, "No, I won't come back. I have my place at Chippiwada." He goes, "I'm very, very busy." He goes, "But thank you very much." So he said that he had never seen that much determination and sense of humor and joy. Even though Srila Prabhupada looked like he had so many obstacles, he was very blissful, and he was just seeing his Gurudev's path for him, and he was following that very strongly. And another sweet story like that I heard from one old Vaishnava who was a Sanskrit scholar, and he said at that time, across the street from Prabhupada's temple, the Krishna Balaram Mandir, there was a Sanskrit and philosophy school that was run by one of Prabhupada's godbrothers. So in those days, a lot of the devotees were writing literatures, and they used to get together and they'd have like a writer's kind of support group where they would bring their Sanskrit and bring what they were writing and help each other if they had any kind of questions, technical things and things like that. So they said that Srila Prabhupada used to come all the time, and he would bring his manuscripts and he would read them in English, and very few of them even spoke English, but he wanted some help sometimes with the Sanskrit. And so he said that they weren't very keen, none of them, because they were high-class Brahmins, were very keen on anybody, let alone Srila Prabhupada, going across the ocean to the West, because it was considered a contamination. So by Hindu law, you don't do it, or you lose your caste, or whatever else you lose. So Srila Prabhupada knew that, but at the same time, when he finally finished his 3rd canto, he brought a copy of each third volume of the 1st canto, right? He brought each of those red books with him to one of the meetings, and he said, "So, look here, look what I have." He said, "This is the first three books of my Srimad Bhagavatam that I'm translating, and these books, they were ordered by Srila Bhaktivedanta Thakur and my Guru Maharaj that they had to go across the ocean and be an enlightenment to the Western people. These books have already been ordered to go there. So I was hoping that you would all give your blessings for these books. So he said, you will all give. So they all said, all right. So Prabhupada very delicately passed around each of the 3 books and asked each one of them to touch it and put it on his head and give a blessing. So they all kind of did like that. And then Srila Prabhupada said, oh, thank you very, very much for blessing these books. But he goes, now I am wondering, these books, they are going to go across the ocean, but they need someone to take them. They can't just go by themselves, and they need someone to explain them and distribute them and tell people about them. It can't be done without someone. So I'm that person who wants to go. So I'm asking you if you will also give me your blessing that I can take these books, that I can accompany these books to America. So then, against their will, they all gave big blessings to Srila Prabhupada. So he remembered that, and he said those were the best blessings that he ever got to give. And he felt like it was some great mercy upon him that he got 1 inch of a chance to help in Prabhupada's mission. A man named Dr. Verma, and he lived with Srila Prabhupada for a certain period of time. He was a doctor, and his spiritual master was one of Srila Prabhupada's godbrothers that Prabhupada had some difficulties with. And at one time, Srila Prabhupada wanted to build a temple at Mayapur for the Westerners. And this devotee was in charge of the Gaudiya Math at that time, and he wanted to give it to him, but it was complicated, and he didn't want to, Prabhupada wanted it on special transcendental terms because he knew how big it was going to get and everything. So this man said he was his secretary at that time, and so Srila Prabhupada used to come on several occasions to talk to his guru. And he said they would go in the room and they would close the door and lock it, and they wouldn't let him come in, and then he would hear some kind of, raised voices coming from there. But when they came out, Srila Prabhupada was always very respectful and pay obeisances like that, and you say, oh, your Gurudev is very nice, and then he would leave. So he said that he developed an attachment for Srila Prabhupada, and at one point when Srila Prabhupada was building Vrindavan, remember Srila Prabhupada's house was there, and he got this sudden inspiration that he wanted to give a donation to Srila Prabhupada for his preaching. So Srila Prabhupada actually invited him to come and stay with him in his rooms. And not only him, but his wife as well, because he came along with his wife. And their kids, I guess, were grown up and in school. So he said that we lived there for several months, just with Srila Prabhupada. He had the main room, and he gave us that side room that's now the library. He said, so we were staying there, and he said he always encouraged me to chant 64 rounds. He said Prabhupada himself always chanted 64 rounds. And I said, well, we never heard that. And he said, oh, I saw it. I would look every morning and see his beads going down. And then you know how the extra 4 are there? So then one goes down, that's 16, the next is 32, like that. So he said, I always watched. He said, because he would encourage me, now you do also. And he said, I can't do, I'm a doctor. But anyway, he said that at one point he got so inspired, and he said, Prabhupada, I have some savings of some, I don't know what it was. I think at that time it was 20 or 25,000 rupees, which was a lot in those days. So he said, I want to give this all to you. And so Prabhupada said, oh, that is very nice. We have so many uses for this. It's wonderful. You can give. So he said he just did it with his hand and gave it to Prabhupada. But then when he went back to his room that night, he told his wife, he was all enthusiastic, oh, I gave all this Lakshmi to Srila Prabhupada. And she went, what? That was the Lakshmi that was for our children's education. And, that was the Lakshmi for, the family house that we needed to work on and stuff. And he said, well, I already gave it into Prabhupada's hands. And she said, no, you should ask him. I can't bear this. I feel like I'll die. And so Srila Prabhupada, so then he went with his wife to see Srila Prabhupada, and then he very humbly said, well, Srila Prabhupada, I gave you that Lakshmi, but my wife is in distress. And what should I do? And so Srila Prabhupada immediately looked to his wife and he said, oh, you are in distress? And she kind of went, well, I don't know. And Prabhupada said, but you must need this Lakshmi for your family and for your children's future and your home. And she said, as she started looking at Srila Prabhupada, she realized that she wasn't in distress. And she said, no, it's all right. It's all right. You just keep it. You please keep it. And then her husband said, actually, if we give like this to Srila Prabhupada, then all the good things will happen to us more better, even from a different angle. And our spiritual life will bloom. So then Srila Prabhupada said, oh, as you like, whatever you like, it's very good. So they kept that Lakshmi with Srila Prabhupada, and they said their life was very wonderful. This man, his name is Sadhu Maharaj, and he is a king. Actually, his father was a Maharaj of Bihar. His grandfather was even a bigger Maharaj until the government started taking away, the land holdings of the kings. He said his grandfather was such a great Maharaj that he established these beautiful, huge temples all over India. And he used to do the worship with his own hands. And when he got older, he turned... Actually, they told a story about how his parents, the other king, the king who was his father and mother, the king and queen, they got him married to a nice lady, and they wanted him to have a son, to be the next prince, to be the king. But the father and the mother, they were both so Krishna conscious, they didn't want anything to do with such a thing. So the grandfather used to come with the spies and look in the room and figure, why is there no son coming? And then they would just see that they chanted all night. The mother and father were just chanting all night. So finally he ordered it. He said, you have to do it. He said, well, I want to go and retire in Vrindavan as a mendicant. He said, all right, you can go, but you have to have a son first. So he had this one son, who was this Sadhu Maharaj's father. Anyway, when this grandfather went to Vrindavan, he became friendly with our Srila Prabhupada at Radha Damodar, because Srila Prabhupada lived at Radha Damodar, and many people go, almost all the Brijvasis go to Radha Damodar every day in the morning and go 4 times around, the Shila of Raghunath Das Goswami and so many special things there. Sanatana Goswami. So he said that his grandfather, when he was a little baby, brought him on his grandmother's lap and met Srila Prabhupada. And he said Srila Prabhupada blessed him at that time, you will be a great devotee. But he said he didn't become a great devotee, he became a king. And he said he had to run all this business and take care of all the holdings of the kingdom. And Bihar is quite a large state. And then he had these huge temples in Vrindavan that were for his people when they came on Parikrama. So there was, 20,000 people came at Kartik, and he had to take care of everybody. And so he said that he didn't, he was not so much more involved in his business. And he took initiation from one old Vaishnav saint. I think you can see his picture all over Vrindavan. He was 125 years old, and he had that very amazing smile. What was his name? Radha Govinda Maharaj. Anyway, he had a relationship with Srila Prabhupada that supposedly was quite sweet, but unfortunately he's gone, so I couldn't interview him himself. But he said, this man said that they all saw all the Westerners coming to India, and everyone was amazed that Srila Prabhupada had done that. And his Gurudev would always glorify Srila Prabhupada, saying that he was an incarnation of Nityananda himself. But he said he was very rarely in Vrindavan. He never got to go there or see anything. He was doing business. Then he said in 1977, around November, he came to see his guru, and his guru told him, you immediately have to go to Krishna Balaram Temple at Ramanreti. You have to go there and you have to pay your full respects and honor to A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, who I have told you before is an incarnation, no less, if not more, than Nityananda Prabhu. He said, so you immediately go. He said, I'm in a basket, I can't go anywhere, because he was so old. He said, but you also pay respects on my behalf. And so this man came. He was just kind of, he said he was dressed not even in devotee clothes, he still had his, business clothes on and stuff. And so he went to the door of Srila Prabhupada's room. And at that time, Srila Prabhupada, they weren't letting so many people in. It was a very quiet time, and Srila Prabhupada was in the room. And many friends used to come there, but a lot of times the devotees didn't know who they were, and they didn't let them come. So he was just humbly standing there from morning until afternoon, until it was getting evening, because his guru had ordered him, so he had to stand there. And occasionally he would say something like, is there any chance that I could see Srila Prabhupada? And they go, no chance, no. And so he'd go, all right. so finally it was getting dark and he was exhausted. He hadn't eaten or anything, or drank water or anything. He was just waiting there. So finally he said some nice girl came and he said, is there any chance that I could pay my respects to A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada? My Gurudev is ordering me. And she goes, well, I don't really think so. And then all of a sudden a voice came from Prabhupada's room saying, who is that, in Bengali? Who is that? And so she just said, well, I don't know, it's some man here. Says he has to talk to you. Prabhupada said, bring him in. So he said he came in and there was a few disciples, but he said they left. And then he was just alone with Srila Prabhupada. And he said that Srila Prabhupada looked at him really deeply. He said, do you know? And then he mentioned the name of his grandfather. And he said, yes, I know, that's my grandfather. He goes, yes, I was thinking there was some resemblance. He said, I know your grandfather. He was a great soul. He goes, what are you doing? What devotional service are you doing? And he said, well, you know, I'm managing the temples and I'm managing the kingdom. I'm doing all the business. And Prabhupada said, no, what devotional things are you doing? And he said, well, I have some paid priests and they're doing the artiks and things like that. He says, what is this nonsense? He goes, your grandfather himself, who had a golden Rolls Royce, he gave up everything and he came to Vrindavan and never wore shoes, and he did all the puja and all the offerings and took care of those deities with his own hand, never let anyone else do. So what is this with you? And he said he was very embarrassed. He said, well, I don't know how I could do that. And Srila Prabhupada said, you will do it. And he goes, and not only will you do it, but one day you will be a great devotee and a great preacher and you will travel all over the world and preach. And he was thinking, and he said, but I know nothing. I'm useless. I don't even know the philosophy very well. I'm just a king. And Prabhupada said, no, it will happen. He said, you are like my grandson. You are my grandson. You are also my grandson. So he couldn't figure out what that was, but anyway, he went home. Oh, and he gave his dandavats for his Gurudev, and then Prabhupada gave his blessings like that. So he ran home, and when he got home, his Gurudev started jumping up and down in ecstasy, saying, oh, you've got the mercy, you've got the mercy. He said, but I don't want to be a preacher. I am a king, I've got 5 children. How can I give up all of this? He said, but if he gave those words, then that will surely happen. So he said that he kind of forgot about it, although it was kind of always there in his heart that he had been given that benediction by Srila Prabhupada. Oh, and he said that when Srila Prabhupada gave that benediction, he felt like thrills in his body. It was something very amazing that he couldn't really relate to the fact that it would ever happen. So then he said, many, many years later, after Srila Prabhupada was gone and his Gurudev was gone, he was still managing that temple. And one day, into the doors came one of my godbrothers, Paramadwaiti Maharaj, who was looking for some Sanskrit books because they had a library there. So he came in, and the first thing he said when he saw him was, he said, oh, what are you doing? You're the king of Bihar. He goes, I know you are. He goes, so what are you doing here doing all this business? You should become a preacher, and you should travel all over the world and preach. And as soon as he heard that, he said, he was stunned, and he remembered immediately everything Srila Prabhupada had said to him. And so he looked at him, he said, well, oh, and Srila Prabhupada also told him you should take sannyas and do this. So he said that, Paramadwaiti Maharaj looked at him, he said, and you should take sannyas as well. So he said he lost all of his arguments, and he just said, all right, well, would you give me sannyas? And so he said as soon as he took sannyas from Paramadwaiti Maharaj, then he realized that Prabhupada's words were also true, because Prabhupada told him, you will become my grandson. So actually he did become formally also a grandson. And now he does travel all over the world and preach. He actually came to our little temple in Hawaii, and he was telling us all sorts of nectar about those early days in Srila Prabhupada.